I wonder if you've seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicoloured Dreamcoat. It's a fun musical with a lot of sing-along tunes. I certainly remember joining in with the audience and the cast when we went to see it when our boys were younger. It's on in the UK next year if you want to see it. When Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice set out to make a musical based on Joseph and his story, they designed it to appeal to a wide audience in a secular culture. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the one thing missing compared with the story in Genesis is God. There are over 30 references to God in the Genesis story of Joseph, but Tim Rice, the writer, leaves every single one out. In fact, the musical totally misses the point of the biblical story. For Rice and Lloyd Webber, it's the story of how we have the ability, with luck, to make our dreams come true. Joseph sings the line, anyone from anywhere can make it if they get a lucky break. But that's not what is going on in this story. The story of Joseph is about how God had a purpose for his life. And through Joseph, God was going to save his family and many other people as well. It all starts with the dreams that God gave to Joseph. So this first act of the Joseph story in chapter 37 of Genesis, God reveals that he has a purpose for Joseph. But we also discover that God's purpose is to involve suffering before triumph. Now we meet Joseph as a 17-year-old youth growing up in what can only be described as a messed up, pretty dysfunctional family. He has four mothers, 11 brothers, at least one sister, and the brothers have different mothers. And you can get sibling rivalry with just two brothers, but 12 brothers with different mothers. And his father Jacob dotes on Joseph and all of his sons that Jacob has. Of all of them, Joseph is his favorite. It's a recipe for disharmony and conflict and bitter resentment. In fact, the first thing we read about Joseph in verse 2 is him helping his stepbrothers with the flocks and then telling his father how bad his brothers were behaving. Is this Joseph trying to get one over on his brothers, or is he acting as a kind of genuine whistleblower? Well, given what we know of Joseph's good character later on in the story, I think Joseph whistleblows because his brothers were pretty bad. But of course, this came at a price, and it didn't enamour him to his brothers. Things are made worse for Joseph because Jacob goes out of his way to show how he is his favourite. And the ornate robe which Jacob gives to Joseph, that robe will prove fateful in what happens later and makes the brothers hate Joseph more than ever. In fact, in verse 4, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Can you imagine not being able to speak a kind word to someone? Well, unfortunately, I suspect most of us can imagine that all too well. If you're like me, there will have been people and situations where you've found it very difficult to find a kind word when we've been wronged. The natural thing is to try and get our own back and say something which is the very opposite of a kind word. And yet, if we're Christians, we should feel ashamed if that's how we behave. One of the hardest things Jesus asked us to do was to show kindness and love, especially to those who've wronged us. And the same kind of kindness and love that he has shown to us, even though we've wronged him. But then comes the dreams. And the dreams make things even worse for Joseph, because you don't need to be a genius to understand their meaning. Even though Joseph is the youngest, he's going to be the one in charge. All his brothers will one day bow down to him, and his brothers hate him all the more for these dreams. And then when the next dream includes his father and mother, who else could the sun and moon be? Jacob rebukes Joseph. Your father and mother and brothers all bowing down to you? He must have thought that his favourite son had a screw loose. Having said that, his rebuke then turns to thoughtful reflection. Was God speaking through these dreams? Was there actually something in this? Jacob knew that God speaks through dreams because he himself had dreamt of that stairway to heaven at Bethel. God had spoken to him directly about the promise that God would give his descendants the land and that all people on earth would be blessed through him and his offspring. Were these dreams of Joseph, as incongruous as they were, part of God's plan to bring about that promise? But that's certainly not how Joseph's brothers saw it. Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist, suggested that dreams are the work of the subconscious mind. He'd tell us that Joseph's dreams reveal his repressed desires. These are his dreams, and they tell us about his deep-seated ambitions. Joseph's brothers did not need degrees in psychoanalysis for them to assume that these were the dreams of someone who is self-centered and full of his own importance. And this is someone with a not so easily disguised longing for self-aggrandizement and with notions of greatness far above himself. Lloyd Webber and Rice take on these dreams is more upbeat. We all dream a lot. Some are lucky, some are not. But if you think it, want it, dream it, then it's real. You are what you feel. But Lloyd Webber and Rice were wrong, and Joseph's brothers were wrong. These dreams didn't come from within Joseph. They had divine origin. They came from God. The dreams came true because God had a purpose for Joseph's life. He was going to rise to greatness in Egypt in order to save his family from starvation during the years of famine and save many other people in the process. And although we could read these dreams as the beginning of a story about a man who becomes a hero figure, it's in fact a story which has God as the hero and demonstrates that God is in charge. And just as God had a purpose for Joseph, God has a purpose for your life and my life. Some people do have a dream. They're fired with ambition and determination to get their own goal. The problem is when that dream is all about them. They're at the center of the dream and not God. Some people have no dream at all. They just drift directionless without any real purpose. But as Christians, we have purpose in life. But it is centered around God. You might have heard a lot about Eric Liddell during the Olympics. He competed in the 1924 Paris Olympics, and 100 years later, he still remains the last British athlete to win gold in the 400 metres. He famously said this when it came to racing: God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. But Liddell knew that Olympic glory was only a passing purpose, and he said this after winning the gold medal. It's been a wonderful experience to compete in the Olympic Games and to bring home a gold medal. But since I've been a young lad, I have had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us in the greater race is in a greater race than any I have run in Paris. And this race ends when God gives out the medals. God wanted Eric Liddell to be a missionary in China, and he devoted the rest of his life to mission work. And on God's purpose for our lives, he said this: every Christian should live a God-guided life. If you're not guided by God, you'll be guided by someone or something else. A Christian who hasn't a sense of guidance in his life is missing something vital. For some, God's purpose is to live a faithful life of service where nothing particularly out of the ordinary happens to us. For others, like Joseph, God's purpose may be to thrust us into the limelight. But all Christians have purpose to the way we live our lives. As Paul expressed it in Philippians 3:14, to press on towards that goal, to win the prize for which God has called you heavenward in Christ Jesus. God has given each of us a purpose in this life to serve and glorify him. And we need to make sure that we're driven by it. But we're still in the foothills of Joseph's story. God's purpose for Joseph involved suffering before triumph. His brothers are 60 odd miles away in Shechem, grazing the flocks, and Jacob decides to send Joseph to them to find out if all is well, shalom, with his brothers and with the flocks. And Joseph willingly sets off towards his brothers' hatred and boiling resentment. And when his brothers see him in the distance, they plot to kill this dreamer. Their hatred and resentment culminated in murderous intent. And the only thing that saves Joseph from death is Reuben's intervention. He seems to have a conscience. Maybe he remembered what God had said to Noah, recorded for us in Genesis 9:7-6. God will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. Reuben recognizes the seriousness of taking the life of another. Man is made in the image of God, and this gives us the reason to value the life of another. God values those he's created in his image, and so should we. And a murderer not only shows contempt for the person they kill, but they also show contempt for God. But left to our own devices, humans can place very little value on another person's life. Why not kill another human? What rational reason is there for not killing someone we don't like? It's only in recognizing that we are all created in God's image that human life is rightly valued. I recently read a book called Dominion. It's about how the West is founded on Christian values. It's by Tom Holland, not the actor, but a historian. And what is remarkable about the author is that he isn't a believer. His claim is that our secular society has forgotten the foundations of our sense of right and wrong. And in the book, he points out the meager value placed on life by the pre-Christian Roman world, exemplified by the way babies and children were left to die when not wanted. Girls in particular were to be ruthlessly winnowed. Pretty much everyone took this practice for granted until the emergence, says Tom Holland, of Christian people. And he tells us about a Christian called Macrina, who lived around 300 AD, who would make a tour of the refuge tips. And the infant girls she rescued, she would take home and raise as her own, believing that without even believing that the most defenseless newborn child had a glimpse of the divine within them. I'm bringing this a little more up to date. I was reading recently about Mary Slessor, who went out as a missionary in what is now Nigeria in the 1880s. And she discovered that amongst the people she was working with, they had a belief that when twins were born, one of the twins was demonic. But they usually couldn't discern which one this was. So they killed both the children, sometimes the mother as well. It's a practice which some still secretly hold on to in some parts of Africa. But Mary Slessor worked tirelessly to try and persuade the people that this was wrong and for them to change their beliefs. She rescued hundreds of children and brought some up as her own, all very much echoing what Macrina had done centuries earlier. And for both Macrina and Mary Slessor, the value placed on human life was firmly based on God's word. That we know the value God places on humans because we're made in his image. And without that foundational truth, human life can become very cheap. But getting back to the Joseph story, Reuben's plan was to save him. Now, he kept this to himself, presumably thinking that he wouldn't be able to persuade his brothers. And one of my favourite films is 12 Angry Men, starring Henry Fonda. It's about a trial and it's set in the jury room. The 12 jurors have to decide the guilt or innocence of a man. And they all think that he's guilty. But Henry Fonda, his character expresses doubt, and the film is all about him trying to persuade them to change their minds. At first, there's anger and ridicule as he holds out on them. But in the end, they unanimously find him not guilty. But Reuben couldn't conceive that he would be able to persuade his 9 angry brothers to change their mind. Groupthink is a powerful thing, and it takes courage to not follow the crowd, to stand up for what you believe. And sometimes Christians are called to do just that, to not follow the crowd, to stand up for what is right. So the story moves on. Whilst they sat down to eat, the narrator paints a vivid picture of a camel train loaded with spices and balm and myrrh heading for Egypt. And Judah, unaware of Reuben's plan, and with Reuben absent, suggests that they sell Joseph into slavery. And the Midianites pay what seems to be the going rate in those days for a slave of Joseph's age, 20 shekels of silver. Joseph pleads for his life, but his cries fall on deaf ears. We read about that later in chapter 42, and the deed was done before Reuben returned to find his rescue plan was blown out the water. All that remained was for them to go back to their original cover-up plan. Kill a goat, smother its blood over Joseph's ornate robe, and convince their father that Joseph had been devoured by a ferocious beast. There's a lot of tearing of clothes. Jacob is distraught at the loss of his favourite son, a father deceived by his own sons, just as he deceived his own father all those years before, also with a goat. And so this first act of Joseph's story ends with a broken family, a father racked with grief and loss, and at least some, if not all of the brothers, burdened with guilt and some remorse. And Joseph himself, sold into slavery to one of Pharaoh's officials in Egypt, about as far removed from the dreams that he had had as it was possible to be. So where was God in all of this? There are at least 3 points in the story where things could have turned out differently. But as it is, events conspire against him. We read that at first he didn't find his brothers, but he was told by someone where to find them. If only he'd not found them, he could have gone home unscathed. But then when there's hope that Reuben will save him, Reuben goes missing at the crucial point, while his brothers continue to plot against him. And finally, that caravan that passes at the right time gives them opportunity to sell Joseph. If it had not passed at that time, Reuben might have saved him. Of course, one way or another, the hatred and the anger of his brothers might have done for Joseph at some later date, but at no point does God intervene. God chose to let evil take the upper hand so that in the end, good would come. The brothers thought they'd done away with Joseph's dreams, but in fact, their actions were part of God's plan to bring them about. And as it was, Joseph had to go through great suffering, rejection, betrayal, ill treatment, sold into slavery, cut off from his family and the comforts of home, effectively abandoned to an uncertain fate, if not death. And Joseph's brothers sinned against him, and he suffered as a result of it. But through all this, God was at work to save his people. And remarkably, this included the very people that attempted to destroy him. God was at work to save Joseph's brothers. So God's purpose for Joseph involved suffering before triumph. And it's a pattern that we often find in the Bible. Moses, David, the suffering servant in Isaiah. Indeed, this may be the path that some of us have to tread as Christians because it is the path that Jesus himself trod. And if we are his disciples, then we follow in his footsteps. And the parallels of Joseph's life with Jesus are striking. Jesus too was forsaken by his brothers, or his close disciples. One of the 12, one of his closest companions, Judas, sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the going rate for an adult slave. And not one of the crowd or one of the Pharisees betrayed him, but it was Judas, one of the 12. He whose value was beyond calculation was sold for a pittance by someone whom he was most intimately associated with. Betrayed, handed over to suffer. Unlike Joseph, Jesus had the power to save himself, but he chose not to. He was doing it for our sakes, to save us. And those who so easily might have been amongst those who pursued him to death, he purposely went to the cross to save. He was paying the price for our sin, our brokenness, our shame, suffering for us, before 3 days later being raised in triumphant victory. So as I close, what can we take from this first act of the Joseph story? God had a purpose for Joseph's life, and God has a purpose for your life and my life. And we need to press on in purposeful service for him. But the pattern is so often suffering before triumph. And that pattern is supremely exemplified by Jesus. Charles Wesley puts it like this in his famous hymn, And Can It Be? Died he for me, who caused his pain, for me, who him to death pursued. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me?